Hello and welcome in to the Knoxville Ice Bears podcast. I'm Joel Silverberg. Thank you so much for checking out the KIB Podcast, whether you are doing so on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or watching on YouTube. Thank you to everybody who has been spreading the word about the new podcast format. We've been having a lot of fun shooting the podcast via video to get it on our YouTube channel. So thank you to everybody who has liked, subscribed on any of our podcast platforms. We're going to have a fun show. We've got Erik Konwinski, the voice of the Fayetteville Marksmen. That's Knoxville's next opponent. They will head to North Carolina this weekend to take on the Marksmen for their only game of the weekend on Saturday night at Crown Coliseum. Knoxville coming off a pair of home games against the Quad Cities Storm, losing on Friday night, rallying to force overtime on Saturday before eventually falling in OT. But a lot of positives to take away from Knoxville's first 4 games of the season. We'll talk to Erik to preview this weekend's matchup as Fayetteville is coming off a weekend split on the road against Macon. The Marksmen are off to a 3-1 start to begin the year, so a solid start for first-year head coach Kyle Sharkey, who took over for Ryan Crothers during the offseason. Looking back at Knoxville's 2 games this past weekend, the home opener for Knoxville on Friday night against Quad City, Quad getting off to a very fast start, and this is something that we saw in Quad City's season opener against Peoria. They set up a grade A chance from the high slot about 10 seconds into the season in the first period against Peoria. Didn't convert on that opportunity, but came out fast in the overtime period that night and scored just 14 seconds in against Knoxville. They scored 10 seconds into the game. A long pass after winning the opening faceoff was deflected by Seth Enzer and then picked up by Leif Matson, skated in and scored. And everything kind of went rolling from there in Quad City's direction on Friday night. Knoxville actually did a really good job at generating scoring chances. Brett Moran had a really solid night in net, ended up getting the 26-save shutout. And in that second period, similar to what we've seen from Knoxville so far this season, Knoxville comes out firing on all cylinders in the second period, just couldn't get a puck on net. Ended up losing that game 5-0, dropped a couple of goals in the third period after the first media timeout. You kind of saw Knoxville have some opportunities that didn't go their way and then win kind of taken out of their sails. And John Gurskus, the Knoxville head coach, kind of alluded to that in the pregame interview before Saturday's game. And on Saturday, Quad City struck first again, scored about 4 minutes into the first period, ended up taking a 2-goal advantage. And Knoxville had chances in that first period too. And Tyson Brower, making his first career SPHL start, made some really good saves. Mitch Adkins scored early in the second, which it was funny. Cooper Smith and I had talked about on the Ice Bears broadcast on 92.5 WKCE. You really felt like Mitch Adkins had to get one at some point during the weekend. He had a really good opportunity during the second period on Friday. He had another good opportunity later on in that game, and Moran made a couple of really good saves against him. He had a wraparound attempt that kind of went off the side of the blade of his stick and just rolled wide off a backdoor attempt after a wraparound try by Jimmy Soper went through the crease. And so Atkins had come so close so many times that you just felt at some point during this weekend, Atkins has to get one. He's in the right place at the right time, picks up a rebound and scores to get Knoxville back to within 1. Kind of a broken up play a few moments later that allowed Quad City to take a 3-1 lead. But Sebastian Miedma, who arrived in Knoxville earlier in the week, made his debut with the Ice Bears on Friday, gets his first career professional goal late in the second period on Saturday to make it a 3-2 game. And then on the power play, Knoxville finally gets one on the man advantage. Jimmy Soper, the captain, scores off after kind of a redirect that hits Brower, lands over by the side of the crease, and Soper's over to locate it and scores off the rebound, and that ties the game at 3. And then after Knoxville tied the game, Quad City kind of started to assert itself down the stretch, threatened to retake the lead in regulation. Taylor Joseph had a really good night in net, especially in that third period. Had a couple of tough breaks in the first 2 periods, kind of leading up to that point in the game. But I thought he did a really good job fighting off Quad City's attack, especially over the last 10 minutes of regulation. Those back-to-back saves with a little more than 3 minutes remaining were huge. And just unfortunate, makes a really good save off of Cole Golka from the right circle. Alex LaPlante does a good job fighting through Soper and Carson Vance to be able to feed Golka on the back door after getting the second chance and creating that opportunity. And not really a whole lot that Joseph could have done about it as Golka scores the game-winning goal. So Knoxville with some really good opportunities in that game. They had a power play with about 2 minutes and 45 seconds left to go in regulation. Didn't generate a shot on goal. And Quad City did a really good job making some adjustments in the second half of that third period because Knoxville really dominated the first 45 minutes. I mean, through the first 2 periods alone, they outshot Quad City 35-12. and found themselves trailing 3-1. So, or 3-2, I should say, at the second intermission, but down 3-1 at one point, rallied to force overtime. So Knoxville has at least shown through 4 games they're going to be resilient, they're going to be tenacious, they're not going to give up on games just because they're down by a couple of goals. They're going to create chances, and they've done that in all 4 games that they've played. So I think it's been a pretty good 4 games, considering it's a first-year head coach, a new roster, and really only 5 players from last year's roster on this team. And you've got some players that have some SPHL experience, but as far as this group having the cohesion as some of the other teams in the league, Quad City, a very veteran team, a very experienced team that returns a lot of pieces from last year, including Brett Moran in net, including Mattson and Golka up front, including Whelan Parrish. That top line for Quad City was firing all weekend for the Storm in those 2 games against Knoxville. And then you look back defensively, obviously Dylan Fournier left the game on Friday with an upper body injury, did not return, did not play Saturday, but getting Doug Blaisdell back, they've got returning experience at all 3 levels on the ice, and it really showed. And it gives Shane Toporowski a lot to work with in his first year as the Storm's head coach. And then he's kind of working the Worcester State connection. He coached at Worcester State for 6 years, and he's got a small handful of Worcester State guys that are all playing together on Friday. They all kind of played on that same line. So it's kind of interesting to see how coaches kind of work the connections that they have from their past stops. And Shane Toporowski's done a little bit of that, but he's also heavily utilizing the players that are back from last year's Quad City team. And the Storm look good so far. They are the only team to be completely unblemished without a loss through the first 2 weekends of the season. Obviously, a handful of teams have managed to make their way through the first 2 weekends without a regulation loss, but Quad City, the only team in the SPHL right now that has yet to drop a game in regulation or in overtime. Huntsville nearly joined them. Evansville overcame a 2-0 deficit to force overtime, and then Brendan Harrogate scoring while sitting down, it appeared, to force Huntsville into the loss column for the first time this season. But Huntsville still off to a good start, not having dropped a game in regulation yet. So coming up on the other side, we will talk to Erik Konwinski, the voice of the Fayetteville Marksmen. He was down in Georgia as the Marksmen took on the Macon Mayhem for games on Friday and Saturday. We'll get his thoughts on the start of the Kyle Sharkey era and what he expects to see with the matchup against Knoxville this upcoming Saturday night. So we'll have more as we continue on the Knoxville Ice Bears podcast. Before getting it up to Egan, he taps it along to Olsen. Olsen carries in, getting to the slot. Olsen couldn't get his shot off, followed up by Miedma. He scores! Sebastian Miedma! As we continue on with the Knoxville Ice Bears podcast, we welcome to the show Erik Konwinski, the voice of the Fayetteville Marksmen. Fayetteville splitting with Macon this past weekend, losing on Friday, winning on Saturday. Erik, it's good to talk to you again. What was it like just kind of getting on the road, having your first full road weekend? I know you had the home and home against Roanoke the weekend before, but what was it kind of like watching this team in its first full-on road trip of the season?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me. This weekend should be fun. We'll get to see the first of many meetings between our 2 respective teams. So I'm excited for the season series, especially after the last season. But yeah, down in Macon, it was just a cool experience overall. Most people are probably familiar that Chuck and Lene own Macon now, and Alex Wall, the team president in Fayetteville, is also team president in Macon. So as far as the fan experience and everything that went into kind of their presentation in the arena, it was awesome. It was somewhat familiar, but what works in one market surely should work in another. And it was super cool to just see the excitement of the fan base down there. So that was cool. And then just the almost like the family dynamic between some of the front office staff. And then when you get to the actual action on the ice, of course, there's no love between the 2 sides, and you know, the coaches are friendly. It's sister organizations, so to speak. But once the game starts, all the smiles are put away and all the warm, fuzzy feelings. So it was awesome. Overall, just a cool trip to be on. And I think the guys too, especially early on in the season, like everyone has, for the most part, I'd expect road games in the first or second weekend of the season. But as you got a whole group of guys that are new, probably about half of our team, they really come together on the road. You get to see, you know, how everyone's interacting and what, you hope there's not too many smaller groups. And so yeah, I mean, one of the mantras this season from the coaching staff is family. And I think road trips like that, especially right at first, really hits home. And so it's cool. It was, and then obviously on the ice, a loss and then a win. So a little bit of everything.
Yeah, I remember talking to Ryan Crothers last year, and he said your team was really young. You had a lot of talent and ended up dealing with a lot of call-ups, a lot of injuries. But I remember him emphasizing that you all were a really young team last year. Well, now you've got 10 players on the active roster that spent time in Fayetteville last year, 11 with Austin Long, who's currently on injured reserve. And then you have another 5 players who have SPHL experience from last season. So you go from being one of the youngest teams in the league to being one of the most experienced teams in the league. Do you feel like that experience has kind of paid off in the first 2 weekends so far?
Well, so far it's really, I think it has, because last year, if you look at it, a lot of what came down to for Fayetteville was slower starts. It was, allowing the first goal. And this weekend, Fayetteville did allow the first goal, or rather, it was last weekend, so they did allow the first goal this season, but they bounced back immediately. Whereas last season, it was always, when are we going to turn things around? And this season, I think already, Fayetteville played without a lead for the first time really on Friday, and had a ton of pushback at the end of the game. I think that's where that is really key, because there was probably about 4 minutes of time with the goaltender out, and they did not allow an empty net goal. I think that's where that experience comes into play. Now, it wasn't the 4 straight goals allowed that you'd like to see for Fayetteville on Friday, but on Saturday it was that mentality of, I think, the experience and getting right back to it, not letting that phase them. They came into the game Saturday and scored 38 seconds in. So I think that's where the experience comes into play. And yeah, these guys, they're comfortable. That's one of the things that maybe wasn't there last year. And I can't speak on a personal note for these guys, but I think right from the get-go this year already, comfortability and with each other, just around the rink from the get-go, it's so important. Whereas maybe last year coming in, tons of new faces, lots of movement, it might have taken a lot of time to get that.
And last year, obviously, you had Simon Boyko, Tyler Coburn, a couple of key pieces from last year's forward group that aren't back with the team last year. Tyler Coburn up in Peoria, and then you have Simon Boyko ended up re-signing in the ECHL. Who's kind of taken over maybe as the alpha offensively for this team so far through 4 games?
Well, it's funny if you look at the points. Grant Loven, he was all over the score sheet last season, massive piece of the team. He had one of those call-ups. He's gone for a couple weeks. He's jumped out, leads the team in scoring, but the whole top line, John Monkovich, he's in his second full season expected to be, but 3rd season overall, if you take a couple games of a debut a couple springs ago. And then with Ryan Nolan coming in 24 games with Peoria last season, that top line has been massive. They're already above 4 or 5 points each. I think Monkovich has 5 and Nolan has 5 or 6, and then Loven has 7. So those guys jumping out offensively, but honestly, it's the steady blue liners too. Tyler Love, he's wearing a letter for this team as well. So one of those things that maybe comes with some familiarity and time with these guys in the locker room is last year is a bunch of guys who really didn't play together. And this year, these guys that have maybe earned those letters and those leadership qualities, they come year over year. And so I think maybe coming from within compared to last year, where you might look at some games played and say, you know what, you've been around, show us what to do. But this year, I think already it's a lot about leading by example early. So I would say, I mean, Grant Loven is very key to this team, but Dalton Hunter, John Monkovich, and you mentioned those guys that have the experience in kind of almost an older team. It's crazy to think, not a ton of guys that have played 4 or 5 years, but bits and pieces here and there. And so there are a lot of leaders on this team, but those ones are the ones that stand out.
And not to mention, you've got Ryan Kenny back this year in net. Didn't start last season as the guy, but kind of had the roster attrition at the goaltender spot. He kind of takes over halfway through the season and is the anchor in between the pipes for Fayetteville last season, ends up having some of the best numbers in the league. How important is he to kind of the success of this team? I know that Daniel Davidson got the nod on Friday, but when you turn to Ryan Kenny and think about a team that has so much offensive talent, you're looking for stability on the blue line. What do you kind of expect to see moving forward out of Ryan Kenny?
Yeah, I think Kenny coming back right from the start, he was at the ECHL camp with Orlando, but immediately when it was, it was announced that he was coming back, and I think he was really excited to come back. It's somewhere where he feels comfortable. He can take over a game or two, and you mentioned Davidson as well. Really strong pro debut for the guy, but didn't get a ton of help on a couple of key plays, and so that was that one loss on the season that Fayetteville has so far. But I don't think it was necessarily the fault of the goaltender, and stopped a penalty shot from Patrick Marcinkiewicz within his first 10 minutes of pro hockey, and that's pretty impressive. So that's worth noting, I think. But yeah, I mean, Kenny is someone who not only I think the room looks to is just a calming presence. He's always smiling. He's always happy. He's super intense when he needs to be. But I think a lot of the guys would probably agree. He's one of those people that just, he goes to work. He's got a smile on his face, even if something happens, lets in a goal, whatever it may be. It's just right onto the next play and right back to it. Doesn't let it phase him. And so, I mean, he's a big piece, and yeah, to have him back is definitely, I think, probably a point of comfortability as well. So, as far as time in the league, he had his 18 wins last season, had a little bit of a skid and some call ups as well. Maybe see some consistency from the start to the finish. And if you take out those couple games that Fayetteville lost beginning of last season, I think they went on a run of like 8 or 9 games with points at least, but they lost those first 2. When Kenny came in, that stability started, and I think it's continued.
Now, Fayetteville's on its 3rd head coach in 3 years. Corey Melkert departs, Ryan Crothers takes over, and then Ryan Crothers is gone, and now Kyle Sharkey gets elevated from his assistant coaching spot. What kind of difference from an on-ice standpoint, X's and O's, in terms of coaching style? What's maybe the biggest thing that stands out about Sharkey as a head coach?
I think it's too early to really put a stamp on how he's completely different. And, I'll be honest, I wasn't completely familiar with the style of Corey Melkert and being around that locker room, but I think last year and this year have a lot of similarities as far as the mentality on the ice and just go, go, go. I mean, you see the offense that Ryan Crothers said from the day that he was hired and announced in Fayetteville that he would rather win a game. I think he said, 7-6 than 1-0. And then last season or last weekend, 2 weekends ago for Fayetteville, they had the 9-6 win. And talking to Kyle afterwards, he was like, well, it's great that we can score 9, but I hope that we don't have to score 7 to win every game. So I think that's maybe a key difference is, and Kyle was in charge of the defensive side of the bench last year too, largely. So for him, I think that's going to be a point of emphasis. And he's mentioned already that he wants to be really focused in details. And not to say that Ryan wasn't last year, but I think already that's something that Kyle Sharkey has made a big point toward. And then really in the locker room, I think off the ice, that's going to be one of the key differences. So far, at least from the last 2 years. Again, I can't speak to how it was when Corey Melkert was here, but I think last year and then this year too, just the aspect of family, the win together, lose together, and stick together kind of aspect is what really Kyle has been talking about since day one.
So Knoxville visits Fayetteville this Saturday night at Crown Coliseum. First meeting between these two teams this year. A little bit of a different from a scheduling standpoint. Both teams got to face the same opponent on back-to-back nights. That's not the case this weekend. So no immediate opportunity to make adjustments depending on what happens on Saturday. So what can Knoxville, especially fans that are making the trip, what can they kind of expect to see from this Fayetteville team? And what's the promotion night happening at the Crown on Saturday?
Well, it is Dia de los Muertos. First of all, we'll talk about the atmosphere off the ice, Day of the Dead. This is the first time that Fayetteville is doing something like this. It is awesome. Already dropped the kind of the look or some of the look on social media earlier on this week, and it's already gotten a ton of awesome, great, positive reactions from the fans. I love it. The Zotos de Fayetteville on the front of the jersey, super cool. Sugar skull kind of look, and that's going to be the look and feel around the arena, but also, not just using it from a style perspective, but also diving a little bit into the history of the holiday itself and celebrating, truly what it means. And for Fayetteville, I think it's very cool. Owned by Chuck and Lene Norris, and Lene of Mexican descent. So it's kind of cool to be able to throw this celebration of life that's very important and a part of Mexican culture, to be able to do that. And then on the ice, mentioned it, Fayetteville has scored first, 3 times out of 4 games this season. And they start early, but playing with that lead is something that the Marksmen want to tidy up. And quick goals against is something that has been a trend, unfortunately, for Fayetteville. So if Knoxville gets one, all eyes on the response shift for Fayetteville. As I think it's 3 times already this season that the Marksmen have allowed 2 goals in under 2 minutes in spans. So that'll be something to see. I think it's not a big, rough, tumble, heavy type team, at least not yet. But that speed and that skill is there, and they're not afraid to mix it up if they have to.
So the Ice Bears will head to North Carolina, take on Fayetteville for the first time this season at Crown Coliseum. Puck drop is set for 6 o'clock on Saturday. Eric will have the call, of course, as always, for the Marksmen on Flow Hockey. Of course, we'll have the Ice Bears broadcast on 92.5 WKCE, the flagship station of the Knoxville Ice Bears. Eric, really appreciate the time, as always. Thank you so much, and we will see you this Saturday night at the Crown.
Absolutely. Thanks, Joel.
Again, that's Erik Konwinski, the voice of the Fayetteville Marksmen. Appreciate his time for joining us here on the Knoxville Ice Bears podcast. Keep in mind, you can check out Carolina Ale House for the road game watch party this Saturday night when the Ice Bears take on the Marksmen. Knoxville looking to bounce back from the 2 losses to Quad City this past weekend. Fayetteville coming off a split against Macon. They are 3-1 to start the year, lead the SPHL in goals scored with 18 through 4 games. Thank you so much for listening to this edition of the Knoxville Ice Bears podcast, whether on Apple, Spotify, or YouTube. Make sure to spread the word and tell an SPHL fan you know about the Knoxville Ice Bears podcast. I'm Joel Silverberg. We'll talk to you next time.